Just to give some quick context, in 2015 I was invited to help on a diabetes project in India, essentially working with 5 doctors, lead nutritionist, professor from an English university, and these what they call specialist diabetes nurses. And what they wanted me to do was to introduce what they called holistic intervention. So they had all the medical side well covered, and it was a kind of high-tech company, but they wanted the other parts that people want to employ with diabetes. And I think it's a credit to all of us that pretty much everything I said about the things we do, macrobiotics in general, they thought was amazing. It was exactly what they wanted, and after 30, 40, 50 years, sometimes of struggling along, there are groups of people out there who think that what we're doing is genuinely amazing in a medical terms. So they kind of, it was one thing after another, they couldn't believe how good it was, and even better that we actually practice it. So it's not something that we say, it's something that we know how to do, and we know how to teach other people to do it too. So we have some incredible strengths. I'm just going to go through the highlights of the update I wrote, and you can read it. My son Alexander helped me do it in a more professional style with references, but the good thing is if you are treating people with diabetes and you read the references, you would then be able to find out lots more research, much more background. So I chose a definition because we need to define everything we put in the reports, and that was my attempt. I put in George Sauer's 7 Levels of Health because I think that historically it's the one thing that's useful all the time. It applies in any situation, and it gives us a kind of holistic definition of macrobiotics. So people measure diabetes by typically pricking their fingers and getting a blood glucose reading, and then once every 3 or 4 months they have a blood test, and they're looking at the red blood cells, the hemoglobin. We can see how the glucose has interacted and get what's called an Hba1c reading. And most of the research is done using these readings. So generally speaking, if we are below 6, we're fine. Typically 5 is a normal number. If we go above 6, we're pre-diabetic. And if we go above 6.5, we're diabetic. So pre-diabetes is considered reversible, and therefore the things that we do will genuinely reverse diabetes for people who are 6.2 or 3 or 4, and they can get better. After 6.5, medically it's not considered reversible, so they're not producing enough insulin, and in that case then it can only be managed. And I think they're probably right, because even if with macrobiotics we could get someone back down below 6, if they start eating ice cream and Coca-Cola and stuff, they just become diabetic again. So it's not a cure, because they're always going to be managing their blood glucose. The problem with diabetes, and why it's such a big issue now, is that used to be an old man's disease, so people typically get it in their 70s. It takes about 15 years for any complications to develop. So if you got it at 75, you're probably going to die of something else anyway before you can get into trouble. So it wasn't such a big issue. Now people get it in their 40s, 50s, 60s. So if you're 50 and you have diabetes, after 65, you're into complications, which is losing eyesight, heart attacks, strokes, kidney dialysis, and foot amputations are the most typical. And why all the governments and doctors are panicking is that the expense of all that is just through the roof. So in the UK, diabetes is almost the most expensive disease that we have to treat, and they're projecting it'll go so far ahead of the others that cancer and heart disease will be relatively small compared to diabetes. So it's a hugely growing issue. Basically, all the research is saying that if we want to eliminate those complications or reduce the chance, we have to keep our Hba1c below about 7.9. Most people, when they're diagnosed, it'll be way above 9, so it could be 14, 15. And medically, they would say the blood glucose is out of control. And so in that situation, the complications are going to come fast. If the blood sugar glucose is controlled to 7.9 or below, the complications are far delayed. And typical symptoms of diabetes is high blood pressure. If that can be controlled, then the complications are much further delayed. So lots and lots of research on that we can use, and I put what I think is the best one up here. So how do we work with it? And I would say there's 4 components. One obviously is diet. Then we have stress, and then we have sleep and exercise. And the point is that with food it's kind of obvious, but I think there's a few things to bear in mind. One is fibre. Fibre is the biggest influence on blood glucose. If you take an apple and you eat a raw apple, it really doesn't have that much effect on the rise of our blood glucose. If we take the peel off, it'll be a little bit faster. We've got rid of fibre. But if we juice the apple and we're drinking an apple juice, in terms of blood glucose rise, it's not a whole lot different than having a sugary drink. So apple juice and tea with sugar in, or Coca-Cola, you're going to get a spike. So whole foods are where it's at with diabetes, keeping the skins on and emphasising fibre. It's also interesting to consider, if you have a meal and thought of it in calories, what does the meal contain in terms of its energy? We should, and no one does, but we should subtract the energy that it takes to consume the meal, which could be 25%. So some things take up a lot of energy to consume, other things virtually nothing. So if we had a drink with sugar in, it doesn't take any energy to absorb it, so we're going to get a huge blood sugar spike. We might have the same amount of sugar in an apple pie, but because of the fibre and the energy we use to digest it, we'll get less calories net and a smoother blood sugar rise, a more gentle curve. Does that make sense? So some foods are energy negative, like celery, so much fibre, and so much goes into digesting it that we use up more energy than we get out of it. So, for example, a trick would be, if I'm making a pumpkin soup, I would put raw celery on as a garnish, or even put larger amounts in the bowl and sort of Vietnamese style put the soup on top. But that celery will bring down even the number of calories we absorb, but also the blood sugar rise. Another trick would be using cinnamon and desserts and so on, because it slows the glucose rise. So stress is probably the other one, and I think we underestimate it sometimes. But if we were in Africa, in the savannah, having our meeting, and we saw a pride of lions, they were very hungry, over in the distance, we would become stressed. And we're going into survival mode. So what do? Our heartbeat would probably double, our blood pressure would more or less double, and we would get glucose into our blood much faster than anything like Coca-Cola. So just like that, we're primed to run away from the lions. So now we've got an incredible glucose rise, and we're pumping that sugar-rich, high-pressure blood into all these big muscles, so we can run faster than ever before. And hopefully we get back to our cars or house or whatever it is before the lions get to us. And then it takes us about 20 or 30 minutes to come back to normal. But because we've been running like crazy, we're using up the glucose as it comes in. The problem humans have is that stuck in a car, being late for a meeting in a traffic jam and getting stressed, the body doesn't see the difference between that and lions. Same thing starts happening. Blood pressure goes up, glucose starts flooding into the blood as though we were having sugar or chocolate or Coca-Cola, not much difference. And at the same time, we're switching off anything we use that doesn't require, that we don't need, any energy consuming function. So immune system gets suppressed, healing functions stop, digestion gets changed, we can't use parts of our brain anymore. And so we're in this state, and it doesn't matter whether we're running away from something or stuck in an office trying to meet a deadline. Same kind of response. So really, unless we can work food and less stress together, we're only seeing half of the solution. And from my point of view, then mindfulness and meditation has to go along with the food. So in the program in India, that was a big part of how we wanted to work with the patients. It's fine. Exercise, it's obvious, but if we eat a meal and then go for a walk, as the sugar, glucose is coming into our blood, we're using some of it up as it comes in. So rather than having a big spike, we have a smoother one. So, and also good to consider that different kinds of exercise, so aerobic would be walking, and that uses up glucose, but if we building exercise, resistance exercise, and start to increase our muscle mass, we have more opportunity to burn off the glucose. So it looks like going to the gym a couple of times a week, doing other kinds of squats and the plank and having some weights at home, particularly in old age, then helps us metabolize and use up the sugar quicker. So the longer we leave it, the worse it is. So it's good to start sooner than later, at least retaining your muscle mass. So my job was then to work with everyone else on producing what they would call protocols for diet, exercise, stress and sleep. And then we did some on addiction. Smoking is particularly bad for diabetics, alcohol obviously. And what I thought was interesting with their approach is that everything has a protocol, everyone follows the protocol, they review the protocol, change it, and then review the results of the new protocol. So there's always this measuring and referencing. And it's very effective. So these patients, they would have their Hba1c, measure their blood glucose, and it would automatically send the reading back to the main computer. So there'd be hundreds of patients, and we could see all their readings live. And then if someone was going too high, they would phone them up, what happened, what did you have? Oh, I got really stressed because we had an argument, or I went to a wedding. Indians are always going to weddings, and in about 3 days, so it's always a big health issue. And we could see what was happening, or it would go too low, which is much more worrying because people can suddenly collapse and have a bad injury and so on. And then with the Hba1c results, we could start to track how many people were in the healthy range and actually work on the intervention that we were using and start to play around with it and see if the results change. So there's a really good feedback system going on. And at the same time we ran clinics for the patients. What would they identify themselves as being the main causes of blood glucose increases, and what did they find most successful, or how could they adapt and change? One area that I would say we're extremely lucky in is that if we're seeing patients, people pay to come and see us, they're self-selecting. In this situation they're not, they're just not feeling well, they have a blood test, they have diabetes. So the difference of working with people who don't particularly want to change their diet, do meditation or anything else is huge, and it demands much more clever strategies to engage people in their own healing. So that took up a lot of time. So we developed the protocols, and then we started to work through how we applied them, and then started measuring the results and refining them. The results by the end were highly successful. The Indian were getting better results with a difficult group of people than typically were being achieved in Europe and America. So it was more successful than the people who should have been much further ahead of the game, and therefore, the responses were good. If we're looking at it from a macrobiotic context, what I like about the 7 levels of health is that George Sauer already identified those 4 key components. So he wrote about sleep, about eating, about vitality and movement, and he wrote about emotions are in there. So he covered the 4 biggest bases, but the other 3, if you like, apart not necessarily for diabetes, but are very relevant in today's world. Memory, thinking, and having that holistic view of life, or how you want to word the 7th one. And so the conclusion for me was that macrobiotics definitely has something to offer in diabetes. And like Patricia was saying, there is this feeling that we wanted to move away from cancer, which I understand, but we don't need to go completely to the opposite. We can be of service to humanity, even though it's medicinal, or however you want to word it, healing, medical. And we do have so much to offer, particularly with diabetes. Everyone in this room would be extremely useful to anyone who's trying to manage their blood sugar. And we have to remember that for every one person who has full-blown diabetes, there's 3 people who are pre-diabetic. The pre-diabetic cohort or group is huge. In India, it's 1 billion people, 100 million people have diabetes, more than the whole of Germany, but they don't know how many people have pre-diabetes. It could be another 300 million people, and it will be the same in our own countries. Lots of people don't realise they're 6.2, and it's those people that don't need to go on medication at all if they eat the foods, if they meditate, they don't get stressed, if they're prepared to exercise for an hour a day, if they can sleep well, they'll be fine. All the research says they can get back without any other intervention. So I would implore us to actively engage in that issue that's come up. It is the biggest issue of our current time, and it goes along with obesity and lots of other things that we should be able to help people with. But I think that the discussion point with this is, are we up for having our own protocols for different things? Are we going to be like a group of individuals who do everything differently in our own sweet way, and we all think we have the best little tweak to our practice, and therefore we're not going to do someone else's because it's different? Or can we work together? Can we develop communal protocols for working with, in this case, diabetes, but it could be high blood pressure, high cholesterol, any of the digestive ailments. All these things, there was so much medical research that confirms everything we're doing, and there would be no argument. No one's going to think we're crazy. They used to, but they're not laughing at us anymore. So we're in all those fields we're taken seriously, and therefore, but I think my suggestion would be that maybe if we wanted to raise our game, we should develop protocols, we should have a measuring system, we need feedback, and we need to be able to update and improve those protocols as we're going along. Yeah, so that would then help us, I think, be much more effective and efficient communally. If that makes sense. And if we want to do that, then how do we do it? How can we arrange these things so that we're all networking together, we're agreeing to different protocols, we're applying them, in diabetes it's so easy because you just have to get the blood work back, and then we're sharing that, we're creating a resource, and then we're looking at whether could we improve those protocols. And 10 years down the road, we could be the best group of people in the world at improving diabetes. And rather than extending the complications by 15 years, there's no reason why we can't extend it to 30 years. So even if someone gets it at 50, they would then never have to hopefully experience all the horrible complications in their lifetime. I think that, how much time have we got?
You've got 4 minutes.
4 minutes, okay, perfect. My reflection is that whether we like it or not, Macrobiotics expanded hugely in its cancer helping phase. I know we've all got different opinions whether that was in the end a good idea or not, and it certainly created problems for us long term, but pretty much every state in America had a centre of activity, every country in Europe had some